I'm not really concerned about agriculture from the American point of view. I don't see any of the products that we make for domestic consumption really seeing significant shifts. Most of our supply chains, in terms of the equipment and the labor and the inputs, whether it's fertilizer, pesticide, whatever, that's all done within North America for the most part. So we can have significant global disruptions in any number of ways, and the North American food cycle is going to be broadly okay. The rest of the world, that is most definitely not the case. We're getting our first taste of disruptions to agricultural inputs right now. A number of the world's fertilizers, the largest exporter is Russia or Belarus. And so we've already seen this calendar year significant changes to who is planting what, where, or how much fertilizer they're using. And when we get to our first good harvest forecast in September, we'll have an idea of just how low global yields are going to be relative to what we think of as normal. We don't have to wait too much longer to find out about that. And this is the start then of a significant calorie deficit on a global basis. Not in North America, probably not in the Western Hemisphere writ large, because that area is broadly self-sufficient and immune to what's going on in the Eastern Hemisphere. But we're looking at input shortages, we're looking at energy shortages, we're looking at capital shortages. And as soon as it becomes clear just how China is going to shake out, we're probably going to be looking at equipment shortages as well. So I can see dramatically reduced output agriculturally in China, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, in the former Soviet Union, and based on how bad it gets, even in Australia. And we're talking about 3 and 5 calories that the world produces are facing chronic limitations in how they can maintain that output due to some sort of shortage in something. And almost none of it applies to North America. Started to understand a little bit more about supply chains. We can thank COVID for that. And because of what's going on with the Ukraine war, the contradictions inherent to the green transition are making themselves very apparent in the European space. And that is going to force a lot of people to make some different decisions. Putting up solar and wind in places that are neither windy or sunny is a questionable strategy in the best of times. And it has proven so spectacularly unsuccessful in Europe that they're going back to coal wholesale because it's the only way they can prevent deindustrialization. But people have not gotten used to going down a level to a little bit more base mechanics that allow modern society to exist. We all understand instinctually that you need iron ore to make steel, but we don't really process where that comes from or what that looks like. And whether it's steel or lithium or copper or zinc or any of the others, they are concentrated in terms of their production zones and their processing zones more so than oil is. And so it is very easy for me to imagine a dozen scenarios off the top of my head where the world loses access to one or more of these materials and how that cascades then through all the other economic sectors, first in manufacturing and then going into transport and agriculture very quickly. That is not something that we're used to thinking about, because a lot of these materials were not processed in the volumes or the purity that we have today before World War II. And so their entire production cycle is defined by an open, globalized world. And if you break that, so many places are going to have to get by without so many of the things that we think of as just modern, essential stuff. We have not started planning for that, but it's coming very, very soon. It depends on who the country is. So, for example, most of the world's cobalt comes from Congo. And without cobalt, there are no EVs. In fact, cell phones, for the large part, go away. Congo is, at best, a failed state. And so the idea that it has any control over how this goes is a little ludicrous. Right now, the mines are owned primarily by the Chinese. They get the ore out, they send it to China for processing, then it's incorporated into battery chassis in East Asia, and then it goes to the wider world. But if you break that first link, the cobalt, your options are limited. Number one, you can come up with a much better battery chemistry, but I'd argue we've been working on that for 10 years with limited success. Number two, you can occupy Congo, which is in essence what the Chinese have done to this point. You can go all neo-colonial. I would like to think that there would be an ethics conversation to be held at that point. Or number three, you can just go without and kiss that aspect of the green transition completely goodbye. And we're going to have some version of this conversation about each and every one of these materials. Most of them are not as physically concentrated in their production like cobalt. For example, iron ore primarily comes from two countries, Australia and Brazil. But to think that all of these changes can cascade through and production and transport of the material and the intermediate products is just going to be unaffected, that's some optimistic thinking. The first three books are more or less about the rise and the fall of great powers. So Accidental Superpowers talks about the crises that are going to erupt because of deglobalization and depopulation, and then the issues that Americans are most likely not to notice. Absent Superpower goes into depth in the shale revolution and then plays it forward to show how that's going to accelerate the American withdrawal and remake the American industrial space. Disunited Nations is on the backside of deglobalization. It's about how the countries that we think of as the future, your Brazils, your Russias, your Chinas, came to occupy that place in our mind, and how in a deglobalized world, collapse is one of the less dire outcomes for them, and instead presenting the country like France and Japan that actually will dominate the human conditions in the future. So all of these are about countries rising and falling in these changed circumstances. The newer book does it from a business point of view. So instead of focusing on the rise and fall of China or Argentina or whoever it happened to be, it goes into each of the economic sectors that define our world: transport, finance, energy, industrial commodities, manufacturing, and agriculture. Shows us how we got to this interconnected world and what that meant, how that changed space, how that changed investment opportunities, and then how everything is going to turn inside out as globalization breaks down and depopulation really drives us forward. It's different lessons for different sectors in different regions. There's a lot of stories to tell, and it's making a bit of a mess in government circles right now. Let's start with the biggest concern. I don't see our narcissism and our political debates as being a geopolitical limiting factor in terms of our power projection or our future power. It absolutely limits what we're willing to consider, but it doesn't actually get to the core of what allows us to be us, for better or for ill. So, for example, 20 years ago when 9/11 happened, we were relatively unified as a country. We were coming off to the 90s, which we thought of as a great decade. And despite the back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans early in the W administration, we were talking about constructive things. Pre social media, that helped. 9/11 happened, that drove us together even more. And for the next 15 years, the United States, from a foreign policy view, was very active. Now, we can all say whether or not, we can debate whether we thought we were active in a productive way. But the point was, there wasn't a lot of dissent within the United States about whether we should or should not be active. It's a question of how should we do it? We can't do that right now. The debates have become so fierce and so petty and so myopic that the United States at the moment cannot have a conversation with itself about foreign policy. And so if it wasn't for Vladimir Putin making his move back in February, we probably would not be part of the global system from a discussion point of view at all. I don't care what the rhetoric of the West says. We just wouldn't have had the bandwidth because we're all absorbed with everything that's happening domestically. Now, in terms of things in the future that could go wrong, let me give you a couple of scenarios. I don't think any of them are high likelihood, but I think they're the things we should be concerned about. So first, short term, we're facing a capital crunch. We're facing an economic transition. We know that we need to double the size of the industrial plant.